Welcome. Hello and welcome to the final episode of Southbank Live for the year. My name is Boaz and I'm joined on this very festive episode by John Butler. John, how are you getting on this week? Oh, sorry, John. I think your mic may still be muted. I can't quite hear you there. Sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah, sure. I'll try again. Yes, I'm very much looking forward to the holidays. Thank you.
Yeah, getting into the festive cheer this week.
Well, a little bit, yes. I mean, within reason, of course. Lots to do, lots to prepare.
Yeah, quite. In fact, for the show, I've prepared eggnog. I've never had eggnog before, so if I am violently sick in the next hour, for anybody watching, you do know why. Yeah, never had eggnog, never made eggnog, but this will be very interesting when I do finally get around to consuming some of that on the show. So in this final one for the year, for everybody watching, we shall be announcing who won our silver round, the custom silver round. But it's also the main thrust of this week's show is to go over some of the lessons learned from the markets in 2021 and looking forward over to 2022 and what we might expect from that. Robert, thank you very much for the comment in the chat. Nice hat, Boaz. And where's your scarf, John? John, where indeed is your scarf this week?
Well, I mean, actually, things are just as cool here as they were last week, I suppose. The cool room sort of cellar temperature, as it were, that I prefer. But you might notice I am wearing a tight-fitting merino roll neck
All right.
under yet another merino jumper, and so you put it all together, and I don't need the scarf.
Oh well, funnily enough, I think I'm wearing a merino wool jumper as well. So we're fully warmed this week. I'm in Aberdeen at the minute, so when it comes to freezing temperatures, we're doing our best to make sure it definitely feels like winter over here. But John, just to start us off this week, I mean, it's been a hell of a year. The word unprecedented has been thrown around so many times. It's a bit of a cliche, isn't it? But it has been a hell of a year for an investor, and just for the average man, I think. But in terms of what you've learned from 2021, what would you be taking away from it?
Well, I mean, I obviously look, every year's different, right? Every year brings new things, but history does rhyme, if not repeat. And sometimes there are these distant echoes from the past. And really, what I think this year has done, if anything, it's reinforced a handful of very, very important lessons that are observed periodically throughout history, and which we all need to internalize. I mean,
Yep.
certainly any sensible conservative, longer term investor who's trying to look through the noise and think about how to structure a portfolio accordingly for whatever given set of circumstances. Don't get me wrong, there's always room for stock picking on the side, but
Mhm.
thinking big picture, I think there are sort of three classic lessons of history that 2021 has really highlighted for me. And one of them is actually directly related to 2020. I mean, you say that 2021 is unprecedented. Well, I mean, 2020 was kind of similar in certain respects. Obviously,
I guess, yeah.
that's when the pandemic arrives. And so one of the lessons here, and this is true of financial markets, it's true of socio-political, economic trends, it's true of lots of things. No matter how convinced you are that something's going to change, that something's got to give, something's not sustainable, um, things tend to go on longer than you think they will. And patience is rewarded in the world of investing. And there are a handful of extremely famous household name investors who have made this point. Obviously, Warren Buffett being amongst the most famous, but there are others. But it doesn't only apply to financial markets and the trends you observe in financial markets. It's also applied very specifically this year to the way in which governments have responded to COVID. These things can just go on a lot longer than you think they will. People can keep making the same judgments for better or worse for long periods of time. An extreme example, and I don't know why this one jumped into my mind earlier today when I was thinking about this call, is what happened in Russia around the turn of the 20th century. I mean, there was a huge revolutionary movement that was already going in the 19th century, and which gathered enough steam by 1905 that it resulted in very very substantial, basically street wars in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and elsewhere. during December of that year. It's called the Decembrist Revolution, and it
Yeah.
fails. It's put down by the czars in an extremely heavy-handed fashion. I mean, not just the young men taking part, but women and children are, I mean, indiscriminately slaughtered in the streets. I mean, we have the historical records on this. It was practically, they were almost doing it on purpose to make a statement, which is just so horrific. It's unbelievable. But the point is this: that shook the foundations of Russia, but it was not until another decade or over a decade and a devastating First World War and loss to Germany that Russia finally actually does undergo a revolution that properly, completely, absolutely, permanently topples that regime. Now, who would have thought? I mean, observers who saw things happening in 1905 would never have thought they could have bought 12 years of time after that, especially given what happened. So that I think is one lesson here, that these things can go on. We all thought COVID would roll through, we'd have vaccines, life would return to normal. Didn't happen. And now people are talking about how Omicron or no Omicron or next variant that comes in or this or that or whatever, 2022 might look similar. It might. You just can't assume that because it has to end someday, someday is tomorrow. You can't do that, and it's dangerous as an investor. So that was kind of the first big takeaway for me.
That's very interesting, John. Wise as ever. I think, yeah, when I say 2021 was unprecedented, and you make the right observation that of course 2021 does share a lot with 2020. For me, and talking about things that last longer than they should, it still feels like we're in 2020. Frankly, it will take me a very long time before into next year before it feels like 2022. I would say. David in the chat said his Yuletide greetings. Thank you very much for joining us, David, and we send them back to you on yours. Gareth has comment any more on Bitcoin, Boaz. Now, yeah, I think there will be room for that in this chat. I think what I'm looking forward to next year will be I think where we'll figure out a bit more about Bitcoin's nature. We're seeing incredible amounts of inflation that we haven't seen for a very long time. And I think this is sort of the make or break for when Bitcoin as a hard asset. We'll find out whether or not it is just a tech stock on steroids or trades like a tech stock on steroids, or whether or not it is actually a hard asset. 2 sips within 10 seconds. Boaz is going all in on eggnog. I must say, though I did make that myself, and it maybe sounds like I'm flattering my own work. That tastes very good. Very, very good. I can see why you guys drink it so much. And we do have a couple of questions on diamonds, which I think is interesting, though we shall get to that later, a little bit later. Thank you to Liam and Seamus for tuning in. John, in terms of other takeaways that you get from 2021, I mean, I'm looking back over it. I think one of the big things for me is that investors can't, this probably sounds kind of dull almost, but investors cannot take supply chains for granted. So the whole Ever Given, Evergreen debacle really sort of hit home to me that with all of the strange price swings that we saw as a result of it in all manner of commodities, it told me that investors now have to take this stuff really seriously. So for a very long period, put in the post-Cold War globalized world, investors didn't really need to bother about supply chains because the world was mostly at peace. And now, with the rise of China, you've been able to you've been able to say that, oh, well, supply chains could get very, very badly disrupted in the future, and investors need to be aware of it. But markets have shrugged that off for quite a long time. So I think the number of different supply chain problems that we've seen this year that have then gone on to affect markets is one of the lessons I'm taking away. But how about yourself? Because I know you're very much into the logistics space. Is that something that you'd be taking away from 2021?
Well, I mean, I don't consider myself an expert in the details, but when it comes to logistics as a sector in general, in which investors can invest and the factors that can impact it, and also historical examples of major disruptions to logistics, to globalization. Keep in mind, this is not the first round of globalization. We've seen globalization before, that said on a smaller scale. You saw tremendous globalization going into the First World War.
Yep.
By some estimates, economic historians make the case that at least the European and North American, that is the developed economies of the day that were industrialized, before the First World War, they were as highly integrated in terms of trade and capital flows as the global economy was all the way into the 1970s or something like that. That is,
Right.
it's anyway, we've gone through various stages of this before. So there usually is some historical precedent, some historical anecdote, reference point. Nothing's going to compare exactly. Again, history rhymes, not repeats, etc. But when you look at history, absolutely, that was proper disruption, and I agree. The logistical negative supply shocks, which are still rippling through, and as I've argued in this chat multiple times, will continue to ripple through in a way which I believe will lead to logistics firms in general being very, very good investments going forward. That has been a huge topic this past year for sure.
And one of the things I find quite interesting with the pre-World War One globalization was it was so pronounced, and people were so aware of it that many thought that there was a very popular pamphlet that was distributed that war was now impossible in Europe because everybody relied on everybody else for all manner of different parts and industries. And of course, tragically, they were just so completely wrong, and the supply chains just got wrecked, and millions of people died ultimately. But
I
everyone thought
believe
that it couldn't happen.
it may have started as a pamphlet. I believe that became an entire book by I believe his last name was Angnal or Angel or something like that. It was called The Great Illusion or something like that, which was the idea that there could ever be a world war again. And he
Yeah,
makes the case in the book that the European economy is simply way too integrated. No one would want to shoot themselves in the foot by starting a conflict. And I believe it was published around 1910, so roughly 4 years before all hell breaks loose.
yeah.
Talk about a bad call.
Yeah, a tragically bad call. If only he'd been right. But there are so many parallels you could draw with that now, where people say we look at US and China and say there can't be conflict here. There's far too much cooperation. There's far too much co-reliance. This could never happen. It would be so stupid. But history doesn't work like that.
No,
Humans don't
no,
don't
indeed.
operate like that, do they? Another one, another thing, John. I'd be curious to know your thoughts on this when we're talking about how globalization, from the 1800s running into the 1900s was such a big force. There was the Turkish cigarette phenomenon, which I find very interesting. I wonder if there are parallels today. So the Turkish cigarettes were a hugely popular thing in the developed world, and it was one of these cases where globalization gets so it becomes so extended that culture on the fringes of globalization, in this case Turkey, ends up actually becoming very popular in the center of the civilizations that it is benefiting. So Turkish cigarettes were a hugely popular phenomenon. Anyone was smoking Turkish cigarettes, all manner of different brands. And today, all that we really have left of that is Camel, which wasn't actually a Turkish cigarette brand, but a cunning American entrepreneur who was like, well, this sounds like it's from, somewhere near the Middle East. If we call it Camel, it's American tobacco, but it's got a camel on the front. And I was wondering, is there an example we could look for today with what is the modern Turkish cigarette? Because the Turkish cigarette back then was 1910s, was when it was full boom time, and then of course World War One occurs, and it doesn't reappear afterwards.
Look, I don't know. I mean, that's kind of it's a fun, it's a kind of a fun story about how trends sometimes just show up, and you don't know how or why, but somehow the zeitgeist just runs with it,
Yeah.
and that can be a good thing in a way, right? If you're talking about some useful new technology, but it can also just be some ridiculous fashion trend that is going to be temporary and which might be subject to all kinds of cross-border disruptions in the event of trade disputes or, God forbid, war. If it's something exotic and foreign, right, as opposed to something which is more homegrown.
Yes, quite. It is a fun experiment. Of course, the history rhymes. It doesn't repeat. So maybe there won't be a modern Turkish cigarette phenomenon that we can find. Though I think that there's got to be something out there. Maybe when it comes to exotic food that people really like in the West, for example, or something like that. But I have gone on a bit of a tangent there, John. Any other takeaways that you'd bring from 2021 to arm yourself as an investor going into 2022?
Well, I think another classic lesson, and this is probably one familiar to many people who are on our call here, um, is this concept of the madness of crowds. There was the famous social historian Mackay, who wrote this book called "Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds," and he looks at a number of phenomena in this book, including financial bubbles, tulip mania, for example, the South Sea bubble, these sorts of things. And the fact is that it is social human nature. I'm not sure it's true of individuals, but in groups, there's a social dynamic whereby even a pretty baseless, ridiculous idea, or one which is kind of okay at least maybe, but not out of this world, somehow gets a critical mass of really passionate verbal supporters behind it. And one by one, they convert that crowd. And then you reach this sort of 12th monkey point where all of a sudden the whole crowd goes over to it. And the minority is unable, even if they want to, even if they're aware of it, they're unable to resist the trend or affect the trend. And off it goes. And the crowd loses its collective mind. And then, as is also famously said, people regain it one by one as the mania comes crashing down all around them, and they have a wake up call with reality. 2021 to me is starting to look a bit like that. I'm really concerned that people just aren't looking behind the curtain. They're not looking behind the curtain regarding corporate valuations. They're not looking behind the curtain regarding the risks that globalization, you might call it, poses to just-in-time inventories, profit margins, and so on.
Yep.
And also, for that matter, I mean, people haven't been looking carefully behind the curtain necessarily regarding how certain government policy decisions are made. I mean, there's tremendous opacity at central banks, as we know. We don't really know how they make up their minds anymore. It's not clear what they're doing because they've all strayed from their supposed mandate. So what the hell's going on? And then when it comes to government policy, obviously COVID responses have really been make it up as you go. There have been some similarities across countries, but also many important differences depending on where you go. It's not clear exactly how major decisions are being made. And and yet people are running with things as if, oh, this is the new normal. Oh, this is just how it is. Oh, this is the latest trend. Oh, this is what we want to be involved in. Well, I'm not sure any of that can be taken away with a whole lot of confidence here, to be honest.
Yeah, one of the things I would probably take with me into 2022 would be mass hysteria is
Yeah,
very much
exactly.
still here. Very much a human phenomenon. We may have more technology, but it's only amplified it,
Yeah,
I would say.
indeed.
We do get a couple of very interesting comments in the chat here. Andrew cheekily suggests that haggis is the Turkish cigarette of the 21st century. This is the fringe cultural phenomenon that ends up becoming very popular at the center of civilization. Maybe Andrew, but not quite yet. I don't think. We get a good evening, Boaz and John, from John. Good evening to yourself. I hope you've got you're suitably festively adorned and all ready for Christmas and Hogmanay. Lorraine comments, the big issues seem to be war on the horizon and the dollar crashing. Russia and Iran are not joining the globalists, so guns are pointed at them. What do you think will happen? Very interesting question there, Lorraine. Would you agree on that, John? When it comes to be the big issues would be the threat of conflict, the threat of war, and a big dollar bear market.
Look, I don't think I'm alone in making what sounds like a bold claim here, which is that the geopolitical situation globally. I mean, there's not a single region you can leave out. The geopolitical situation globally is more unstable than it has been anytime since the Cold War. And indeed, some people would argue that the Cold War itself was actually pretty stable, with the exception of a handful of frightening periods, such as Suez, Cuban Missile Crisis, and a couple other things. Right? Um, th- Everything is up for grabs. It seems all of a sudden, the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan is more than symbolic. It really is a recognition that the balance of power is shifting. And if you then also look at what's been going on in the meantime, more quietly out of the public spotlight. Look at increased Chinese investment in Africa. Look at the infrastructure projects that are being sewn together between China, Russia, and the Central Asian republics. Take a look at what's happening with the gas disputes in Europe and Germany being unable to make up its mind whether it's going to use Nord Stream 2 to get its winter gas, or any gas for that matter, or not. I mean, there's a whole lot going on. It's not just the possibility of a conflict in Ukraine, which sadly seems to be the most immediate concern in most people's minds, based on recent statements, which are pretty provocative on all sides, if you ask me. It's much more global than that, much more general. And it does suggest to me that anyone who's going to take a view on 2022 without incorporating, the unknown unknowns of what that could lead to, is not being cautious enough.
Yeah, it does seem like the next decade will be quite well. The 2020s, we've started them off with quite a deviation from the norm, or a deviation from the previous couple of decades. So how this develops, it can be very intimidating. I think there's going to be a lot of close encounters at the very least over the next nine or so odd years. We do have some other interesting comments here in the chat. Seamus, sorry, suggests that Japanese whiskey might be the Turkish cigarette of the 21st century, which is very interesting. Though it was the 90s, I think it was the 80s and 90s. Of course, 80s were very big for Japan, and of course they had the Big Depression. They had a terrible 1990s period. And they cut back on their whiskey production over in Japan, which is one of the reasons why it's so incredibly expensive to get it now, because, of course, whiskey takes an awfully long time to make. But these days, the price of some Japanese whiskies is very high. But, of course, even in Scotland, you'll find plenty of Nika and Hibiki over here. So maybe Japanese Scotch is the indicator, but I would say it's been around and been very popular for a long time. Now, on diamonds, I thought that was a very interesting comment. This is from Liam, who says, hello, Boaz and John, Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays, respectively, and the same to you, Liam. I know an investor who only buys diamonds. Are they a better bet than gold and silver? Thanks, Liam. Well, thank you for that question, Liam. That's a very interesting one. John, I imagine you've spent an awfully long time sort of pondering the case of diamonds and relative to precious metals. What would be your take on that?
Well, certainly. I mean, as someone who's bought a fair bit of jewelry for, the ladies in my life through the years, I I have indeed needed to consider diamonds. But what I would say is this: is that gold and silver, look, I mean, they have served as money, a store of value, a medium of exchange in many cases since the dawn of recorded history. The whole diamond phenomenon is pretty young, right? I mean, diamonds were not a highly coveted gem until really only about 150 years ago. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, they were nice and whatnot, but they kind of competed on, maybe I'm exaggerating, but a sort of a roughly level playing field with emeralds, rubies, other precious stones. And sure, they're beautiful and they're wonderful, adorning ladies' jewelry, or for that matter, some men's jewelry, and obviously royal regalia and whatever else, and that's fine and dandy and all. But this move of the diamond sort of cult, almost, if you want to call it that, to the forefront of just always and everywhere thinking diamonds are just, other factors equal, just better than other gemstones. That was really one of the most successful marketing campaigns in history. This is De Beers, right? This is the legacy of Rhodes and others, and the Oppenheimers and the De Beers, to basically create tightly controlled supply, regardless of annual output. They were always very, very strict to try to keep the actual release of new stones to the public at a level which they believe, based on what were probably quite sophisticated microeconomic calculations, would maximize their revenue as a monopolist producer. Economists have models for how to do that sort of thing. And that it looks like they did that, and at the same time spent huge sums of money to try and push diamonds to the forefront as the most desirable stone, and it worked. It absolutely worked. And diamonds are a girl's best friend. Some of the brands like Cartier and Tiffany began to embrace diamonds as the absolute end all be all.
Yep.
It got to the point where it wasn't even a wedding, it wasn't an engagement ring, excuse me, unless it had a diamond on it, which is kind of ridiculous when you think about it. But I mean, literally, that's where things got to.
Yep.
So, okay, let me answer this. Gold and silver are simply qualitatively different. Diamond values were artificially supported and created as such by this marketing campaign. I'm not sure how long term sustainable that is. And the other thing to point out, diamonds aren't fungible the way gold and silver are. Gold is gold, silver is silver. Every diamond is different. Yes, there are classifications, but hey, if it were that easy to classify diamonds in such a way as to kind of have these liquid reference points that could serve as an index or a
Yep.
futures contract, if that were even possible, it would have been done by now based on the value of the market. That no one has succeeded in that tells you everything you need to know. Diamonds are simply too illiquid to be able to trade in the way that gold and silver trade. And in other words, to the extent that they are an alternative money or a monetary substitute on par with gold and silver, I don't believe that's the case.
That's interesting. There have been numerous attempts to try and create a futures
Yes.
contract and an index, but none seem to have succeeded. It's funny when you're speaking about the roads, the De Beers Cartel. I remember reading a while back, John, that when they were selling these, when they were doing the tenders, the people who were buying wouldn't actually be able to see the stones. They were just sacks. They were black sacks full of diamonds. And because they controlled the entire market, nobody who wanted diamonds could go anywhere else to get them. And we do get a comment in the chat from Seamus regarding the artificial diamonds that are now being created at scale in various places in the world. And maybe that is another factor which would disturb the status quo when it comes to diamonds. But very interesting from Liam, knowing an investor who only buys diamonds. That seems quite specific. There's pink diamonds. There's always been an interest. Well, not always been, but it's a very interesting sector from my side because from the Argyle mine in Australia, pink diamonds have they have quite an interesting history, and they shut that mine down, I believe, a couple of years ago. And but there's still those pink diamonds. It's still a market for it, and ladies do like pink very often, though not always, of course. But looking forward, I think we're about halfway through the show now, so I think it's a good time to announce who won our silver round last week. The question to win one of these things, a custom hand-poured silver round that's been assayed in Edinburgh, was what asset tied together Richard the Lionheart, King David II, and Julius Caesar, and how? What actually... what was it that specifically tied that asset to all three of those people? We did receive many responses across our social media channels. Thank you to everybody who participated. In the end, there were, I believe, 34 winning answers. So if you did get the right answer, you did have a pretty good odds of getting it. But the person who did win, I can announce, is Keith J. There was only one Keith who did put that in. So Keith J., congratulations. You shall be getting one of these. We'll be reaching out to you in the near future through our YouTube channel. So this will be, we will respond to your winning comment to make sure that we're dealing with you and there's not an imposter who shows up and says, "I'm Keith J, can you send it to me?" We'll be doing that soon, so do stay tuned to that. And congratulations. And to everybody else who participated. It was a good bit of fun, and we did get some great answers. So not all of them were correct, but a lot of you did tweet on that it was what did tie them together in the end was that they were all ransomed for silver specifically. They weren't ransomed for gold. I believe Richard I's kidnap on the way back from the Crusades, where he was ransomed for 25,500 kilos of silver, is where we get the phrase "king's ransom" from. Though by modern prices, John, I believe that's roughly 14 million quid, which doesn't seem like very high for a king's ransom. If Prince Harry had been kidnapped when he was in Afghanistan by the Taliban or something, I reckon they could have gotten a fair bit more than 14 million quid for him. But 25,500 kilos of silver is still not to be sniffed at. And neither is 1 ounce of silver. So congratulations, Keith. Now, moving slightly forward, John, I think looking forward into 2022 in terms of our general predictions, is there anything that you would like to predict for the coming year? Because this will be our last show before Hogmanay.
Well, I believe that next year, I mean, don't get me wrong, again, a lot of stuff is up in the air. We've already discussed the geopolitical situation being so unstable, and whatnot. Obviously, crypto's been all over the place recently, so who knows what's going to happen next there. And again, the stock market has more or less managed to push higher, although led by big tech. And I predicted that at some point that's going to have to reverse. But hey, who knows? As I just said a moment ago, these things can go on longer than you think they will. So what I'm going to focus on is something a little bit different, but it's an area where I believe you're going to see multiple fronts develop. In fact, they're kind of developing now. And this is going to be a general de-rating of all things green. I think we've seen peak green, and I think there's a lot of evidence for that. And so I think a big theme, and you can approach it in multiple different ways, and I can make multiple different sort of general predictions around that theme. I think we've seen peak green, and we're going to see a big reassessment of the valuation premiums placed on green during the course of 2022.
That's very interesting. We were talking about a little bit about mass hysteria earlier, and of course, I'm not disrespecting those working in the renewable sector, but the number of just articles that were published in 2020 and indeed in 2021 in the financial press regarding ESG investing, environmental, social, and governance standards investing, it really did feel like there was sort of a crowd, crowd instinct at play where everybody was just deciding to talk about it during lockdown with the whole build back better thing. And we did get a question in the chat earlier in the show where somebody was asking what the outlook was for renewable investments. Could you tell us why, John, exactly you think next year will be the year when we see that we've seen peak green?
Well, look, I've been a green skeptic for years. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm from California. When I grew up, environmental issues were extremely important, including many of the disputes around the possible opening of parts of the California coastline to offshore oil drilling, something which was immediately politically impossible once you had the big Exxon Valdez spill up in Alaska. But had that spill not happened up in Alaska, it could well be that some of these drilling rights would have indeed been granted when I was young. And so don't get me wrong. I mean, I'd love for us to find a way forward, being more reliant on green energy and other forms of green tech. But as I've said before, look, I mean, there's just been so much overpromising and under-delivering in this area. It's pretty shocking. And at some point, people are going to wake up. And to be honest, I think they sort of are waking up. You mentioned ESG a moment ago. The concern around greenwashing, no one ever used to really talk about it much. But this past year, there's been lots of talk about greenwashing and about how ESG guidelines are so subjective. They can be practically whatever you want them to be. And there have also been a couple very popular documentary films that have done quite well in pointing some of this stuff out over the past couple of years. So I think, and oddly enough, some people say, and I've seen the case made, oh, but if we just really tighten up these ESG guidelines so they're more objective and not subjective, and we have proper policing and this and that, then everything will be fine. No, because it will expose that the sector is hugely overvalued, because people are going to have to start pulling money out of all this stuff that doesn't meet those more objective guidelines, and you'll have to go through a multi-year reassessment in the meantime. And people are, investors aren't going to wait for that to happen. They're going to cash out and wait till the smoke clears. So I'm very concerned about it now, not just in theory, as I've been for a while, but I think the timing is actually right for a general derating of green. And also, I mean, you just mentioned it, Build Back Better. Hey, guess what happened in the US, right? The Build Back Better bill, which contains all kinds of subsidies for green this and that, which is just the way things are done anymore in Washington, looks like it may not be going through, at least not in its original proposed form. And here we are going into the holidays. Chances are nothing's going to get done. And then it's next year, and who knows what's going to happen. And finally, it is wintertime. Europe is cold. Russian gas isn't flowing. Germany's nuclear capacity is almost zero at this point. And it's getting cold, like properly cold, and power bills are getting properly expensive. I mean, historic highs. The fact that Germany, one of the most eco-aware, progressive countries in the world, is restarting not just some coal plants, but brown, dirty, lignite coal plants
Yeah.
to try and deal with the energy crisis tells you everything you need to know. We've seen peak green, at least for now.
That's very interesting, John. The thing with green that, you know, if everything was free market and there wasn't government intervention here, there weren't government policies and programs, I would definitely agree with you on that. But what makes me hesitant regarding whether green does just keep it goes through this sort of bubble bath phase where you get these big blow off asset prices, and then it goes down for a while, and then it goes up again a few years later in various sectors within the renewables space. The issuance of green bonds over the last couple of years has been incredible. So there's a huge amount of organizations, and indeed, I believe some governments who have been raising green bonds. They've been borrowing money to invest in renewables. Explicitly saying this money is going to be invested in the renewable space and making the world a cleaner place, etc., etc. And it's in the billions. I mean, there's a big move there, and I wonder whether or not governments pushing for more green. I mean, we should probably use a better word for it, but more renewables efforts makes me wonder whether, even if there is massive underperformance and over-promising, under-delivering, that maybe if more and more money gets shoved into the space, that it could end up being an enormous speculative bubble
Well,
yet again.
But the thing is, though, we've kind of already seen that, and I think we'll do a big reassessment. Okay, look, the
Mm,
subsidies have been around for quite a while, and they're very, very large. And yes, fine, governments might be reluctant to pull those subsidies, but let's face it, right? Tax burdens in those countries that are big on green subsidies are
yeah,
at historic highs. Here in the UK, the tax burden is higher than it's been in around 70 years. And now you're facing a wave of much higher power prices, utility prices in general in the UK and in most of Europe and in much of the world for that matter. And of course, the general inflation is rolling through, also in food and other prices. All this is going to squeeze, your typical tax-paying middle-class household. That will change the political landscape. That will change the political willingness to accept such high tax burdens, or God forbid, even higher tax burdens, just so we can keep experimenting with the latest, greatest green technology, which depends on subsidies. I think we've kind of reached a sell-by date here. We're going to have to reassess. People are going to have to take a step back and say, wait a minute, which of these technologies are actually viable, which are not? Where should we maybe pull some subsidies? And where should we maybe make a renewed effort somewhere? But that sort of process, I believe, will lead to a general repricing of the entire sector while the reassessment takes place, and the almost religious cult-like, aspect to it, madness of crowds, as it were,
yeah.
sort of comes off.
Yeah, the zealotry may actually evaporate after a while, perhaps. Perhaps one does wonder, if the whole Extinction Rebellion thing and lying down on roads is something we're going to see a lot more of in the future. Hopefully not. I do get a question from Seamus, which I think is quite apropos here. What about the tax demands that some European countries have made of companies running offshore wind farms in the UK sector of the North Sea? Will that not affect profitability? Yeah, what would you say to that, John?
Look, I mean, it's all up in the air, and what concerns me about that question is precisely this. This is all so political, right? It is just unbelievably political, and
Massive, yeah.
most investors, they don't necessarily like investing on political whims that might come and go. Now, that said, this trend's been in place for a long time. The whole green thing's been in place for a long time. And politicians have been riding the wave as a way to remain popular or become more popular for a long time. But again, things have changed. You have a situation now where people are demonstrably facing the real economic costs of this overpromising and under delivering. So I'm not saying that governments won't keep trying. I'm not saying that there won't still be pockets of opportunity. There are always pockets of opportunity. I believe the sector in general is just do a general reassessment.
Yeah. Well, I'd certainly agree with you there, John. I do think that, well, some of the promises that have been made do seem, surely somebody's got to get a bit skeptical about that after a little while. Some very interesting comments in the chat. I have seen the quantitative key thing is very good. Everybody's saying that they are Keith, of course. Yes, and or that they are Spartacus for that matter. Liam, a great compliment from Liam. There's 154 people watching, but only 16 likes. This is another brilliant episode, and John is excellent again on the general knowledge.
No.
Well, thank you for flying the flag, Liam. It's great. It's great that you are enjoying the show, and it's very. Very stimulating to do these during the evenings, I must say, John. Seamus suggests that K-pop could be the Turkish cigarette of the 21st century, given its popularity over here. On a similar thought, I did think that mukbang, a form of Korean cuisine, could be the Turkish cigarette, but I've not seen it take off that much. It's just a sort of a YouTube phenomenon that I've noticed over the past while. And indeed, somebody's suggesting that Gangnam Style, Seamus again, Gangnam Style is an example of the K-pop phenomenon, which really does bring me back. Gangnam Style, I think that was a decade ago now when that became the most popular video on YouTube a while back. Now, and a question from David on the green topic. You didn't mention China in your point regarding the green sector. You can't leave China out on whether we're talking about green or pollution. Yeah, I mean, John, do you think when you talk about a general re-rating in the sector, do you think that countries like China may change their tune regarding their green initiatives?
Oh, I think over time they will. But I mean, China's priority is still to grow. It's still to build out its infrastructure and to have whatever power capacity it needs. Someday, it's quite probable, if you wait long enough, that China will have the luxury, if you want to call it that the developed West has had for quite some time to make decisions regarding how and in what amount and where to try and greenify various aspects of their economy. But we are just miles away from that, or I mean years away from that, in my opinion. Actions speak louder than words, and China, to be fair, they don't actually talk up the green thing a whole hell of a lot because, to be honest, I think they're just not bothered. It's not their priority. But actions do speak louder than words. China is not building the Belt and Road infrastructure in order to unlock green energy potential. No, they're doing it to more easily get oil, coal, and gas from Russia. Okay.
Yep.
China is not investing in Africa because they think it's a practical, place for them to generate solar power or something like that. No, they're investing in the oil fields, and they're arguably, although this is getting very, very politically sensitive, they're arguably encroaching perhaps on some of the uranium deposits, which will bring them into conflict with France. Although that's kind of a topic for another day. Again, the fact that China is being as aggressive as it is in Africa is not because they're pursuing green energy. It's because they're pursuing fossil energy and perhaps to some extent down the road, some diversification of their uranium supply, which is currently effectively 100% Central Asia. So, that's what's going on here. The same is true to some extent, of course, of India, although India is somewhat less aggressive than China in that regard.
Very interesting topic on China clashing with France over uranium in Africa, John. I think that is a topic for another day. I will definitely remember it for a show in 2022. On that note, regarding China, though, we do get a question from Ian regarding what happens if China invades Taiwan. Will the West block all imports from China? Is that something that you think should be on our radar for 2022, John?
Oh, I think Taiwan, just like everything else I mentioned earlier, right? Taiwan is in play. It's absolutely in play. And again, going back to what you mentioned, right? I mean, is it really conceivable that highly profitable trade relationships are going to be sacrificed because of a dispute around Taiwan? Well, of course, history shows you that these things can happen. Taiwan is extremely important economically to the world. Absolutely. Who knows what's going to happen, though? The fact is that it is in play. And I think that Also worth remembering now, let's bring up another country that's involved in this thing is Japan. I'm not sure I mentioned this on this chat before, but I have written about it in the past, which is that Japan, of course, is heavily reliant on nuclear power, but they're also, of course, heavily reliant on fossil fuel imports. Those fossil fuel imports have to come overwhelmingly through the Straits of Malacca and through through the South China Sea
Yep.
and on past Taiwan in order to get to Japan. And depending on which particular island of Okinawa you're talking about, Okinawa is actually closer to Taiwan than Taiwan is to China. And so Japan gets involved in this too. Their
Yeah.
own their energy, not just semiconductors, but their energy security is threatened by what's happening with Taiwan. And so the fact that China looks like they might, give it a go at some point, is a critical issue to the whole world. And yes, I mean, would China be willing to risk that? Would the rest of the world be willing to risk a war with China over it? I don't know, but it's a huge flashpoint. It's not just the U.S. versus China. There's much more at play here.
What do you think the response could be? So, for example, would there be? Do you think is it even possible for there to be an embargo on China in the event that they did take Taiwan? So, just like we were referring to earlier about globalization, people thinking that war is impossible because we're all so economically intertwined. Do you think? Do you think that those in power in the West would have the stones to do something like that and go for a full trade
Look,
embargo?
it's what you mean by embargo. Embargoes are almost never 100%, right?
Yeah.
They're almost always selective, and indeed, even within to the extent they are pretty comprehensive, they're selectively enforced. I mean, bizarrely, right? Even in the First World War, to a lesser extent, in the Second World War, indirectly, Great Britain was still trading with Germany. They were doing it through Sweden and Denmark and whatnot, but it was still happening, and everyone
Yeah.
knew it was happening. But the fact is, both sides, kind of had vital things they had to get this way or that way, and so it was still sort of going on. Also, there are those historians, although they're kind of fringe, I have to say, but there are those historians who believe that in order to save face, largely, the Royal Navy blockade of Germany in the First World War was nowhere near as effective as they claimed it was. Nowhere near. At least not initially. It took a long time, and then eventually it will be more effective. Hence why Germany's practically starving by 1918. But the point I'm getting at is that you can say you're going to embargo a country, but what that really means in practice, who the hell knows? Now that said, again, in this day and age of hyperglobalization, the idea that even a minor embargo of China would be imposed and enforced by the United States and others would be so unbelievably disruptive. I mean, I don't even know where to begin. And it really, I mean, would the world be willing to do that to get China to keep its hands off of Taiwan? I don't know.
Mm. Yeah, questions we should be asking though, because as you say, it's in play, it's on the table, and just as World War seemed inconceivable in the early 1910s, things that seem inconceivable aren't always impossible, are they? Now we are getting on slightly for time, John, and we do have, of course, you have provided your short for us
Yes.
this year, well, for 2022. This evening, it's looking like green is not your favorite for 2022, not the horse to follow. What would be your long for 22?
Yes. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pair up. I mean, again, I have described my short, obviously, for in the various ways in which I think green is going to be kind of under general pressure
Yeah.
on multiple fronts. But first thing I want to say, it's a bit of a catchy, sort of trite thing to say, but in 2022, I believe black is going to be the new black, and by that I mean oil and coal in particular. Why oil and coal in particular? Well, obviously, if we have gas disputes in Europe, then you're going to have to top up your power some other way, and the nuclear capacity in Germany simply isn't there to do it. So they're going to have to become more reliant on coal and oil for some period of time. I believe it almost goes without saying. And then again, the general reassessment of the viability and reliability of green energy, in particular for base power, is going to lead to multiple countries having very serious conversations with themselves as to whether and to what extent they should slow down their planned phasing out of fossil fuel generally, so that the overall transition is both longer and less disruptive. Now, if these things are true, then the reassessment of the coal industry that we've already begun to see this year has a hell of a long way to go, in my opinion. So that to me is something to watch as sort of alongside of being short the green side. And then the other thing I wanted to mention, and again, this is not, in a way, not today's topic, but I actually think there is a trade here. The whole Africa story with China getting more and more influence there, and slowly but surely beginning to bump up against some areas that I believe France regards as critical national interest. 2022 may be too early for that dispute to become more visible, but the uranium market is not going to wait for it to become more visible. And if there is some concern over the stability and reliability of uranium supplies out of Africa due to whatever dispute it might be, whatever region decides to break away from whatever country, because they're being offered some incredible royalties deal by China, who knows what it is, that could cause real concerns in the global uranium market. So I think uranium is also along for next year. I felt that way this year, to be honest, but I think it has much, much further to go, not just because of the general point that uranium is an ideal source of reliable base power generation, much better than any green technology that exists, right? I mean, hydro, fine, but it only exists in certain places, right? So not only that, objectively, no matter what you say, but also some of these specific concerns that there might be some issues regarding African uranium supply going forward.
That's very interesting, John. I think the inflation story, when you talk about black, which was the old black, is the new black once again, black gold and coal, of course. It just feels like the inflation story is forcing that to occur. I can't see how, when you've got strong inflation, you don't end up with a really strong bull market in those sectors.
Look, I mean, inflation's happening for a variety of reasons. Of course, we know that loads and loads of money, was created post 2008, and that just kept going and going and going. Yes, fine, it got stuck in the banking system. It went into asset price speculation, but the negative supply shocks of policy responses to COVID, combined with the extreme fiscal largesse, which in some cases, continues unabated, notwithstanding Biden's Build Back Better suffering a setback. I mean, that's an inflationary mix, big time. And if you look at the producer price pipeline in most major industrial economies, I suggest we have a long way to go yet, right? That this is far from over. And yes, so the fact is that the cost of living is rising, and your typical household is going to notice that. They are noticing it, and they are not going to be inclined to pay extra for something that's green, given that it's already getting way too damn expensive in the first place. They're going to go
Yeah.
back to what they know and what they understand and what's affordable. And this is true at the national level as well.
Yeah, I think it will be very interesting to see all of the hype that we've seen over the past years. As I was saying, all of the journalism we've seen regarding green being the future, and how that might clash with the reality of people sticking with fossil fuels to some degree, or the sort of the unceasing demand for said fossil fuels when the price of everything is going up a lot.
Look, I mean, don't get me wrong. I like to think of myself as an optimist. I like to think that somehow, some way, someday, green is the future. But this idea that, based on the track record we have of massive overpromising and underdelivering, combined with governments actually shortening, their timelines for getting through the transition period, that makes no sense to me. It's never going to work. It will be disruptive to the point of toppling governments. In some cases, perhaps leading to outright revolution if people try to force that on people. It's just not going to happen. So we're looking at a much longer transition we're looking at much more research into ideas that perhaps no one's even conceived of yet before I believe we're going to get back on that sort of track in a sustainable way.
We do get a question from Leon to counter that, but isn't the cost of green going down a lot? I mean, we have discussed over-promising and under-delivering on a lot of green projects, but of course there still is development, there still is progress in the space, and the cost of various green applications has been going down. Do you not think that might be able to stem some of the backlash against green, John?
Well, look, I mean, if that were true for base power generation, reliable base power generation, then that would be a big deal. But indeed, this only applies to intermittent generation when conditions are favorable, say for wind, for example, right? And when you don't have, too big a snowfall covering solar panels in Germany, or whatever it is, right? I mean, that's the problem. The problem is not that we can have some incremental green power available, not at all. And there are times when, I mean, as I recall, it was 2 years ago, maybe 3, that for the first time, German solar generation was actually putting more power into the German grid than Germany actually needed for
Right.
its power needs that day. I mean, in a way, that's a huge achievement and that's nice. But is that reliable through the season, through the year? Is that reliable in all conditions? Absolutely not. Governments and whoever was advising them, who knows, they somehow seem to think that just because something is getting cheaper when conditions are favorable, or at least not unfavorable, that somehow that's just the way it's always going to be, has been proven so wrong over the past year. Incredibly wrong. And yeah, I mean, look, I'd like to say that some heads are going to roll when it comes to who advised on these decisions and
Yeah.
who's responsible for them. But as we know in politics, accountability is it's frequently a complete no-show,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure that sort of reassessment is going to occur very quickly at the national level. But hey, enough inflation, enough populism, enough people living in cold houses, struggling to keep the lights on and whatnot. That'll change things.
Certainly, certainly. We do get another question from Leon saying, "Might battery technology be close to meeting and solving the intermittency problem of green?" Well, Leon, that is certainly what those in the green camp are hoping for. It is certainly what many believe is will be imminently solved by progress made in the battery sector. Though, to my understanding, I'm no expert, but we do have yet to see the master solution, the keystone that will actually make the green century really possible. I do like, John, that you like to think that you are an optimist. Of course, we've had so many grim discussions on our Southbank Lives that perhaps some viewers have gotten the wrong impression. But no, I believe I like to think I'm an optimist too. So we have that in common, I think. Now, we are getting on a little bit for time. Shaheen asks who won the silver competition, and Keith. Then someone saying not Keith. Who is Keith? Well, Keith was the person who has won this competition. As we do more of these Southbank Lives in the future, we shall be doing more of these giveaways, or at least I'd very much like to. So do look forward to that. If you are enjoying these shows, of course, I do encourage you to like and subscribe. It really does help us out, and of course to tune in or share it with somebody who you think might enjoy this form of content. John, any closing remarks as we finish off Southbank Live for 2021?
Well, I would just say that as I think we agreed on our last episode or the one immediately prior. It's been a year that has surprised everybody. It's a year that anyone who thought they knew what was going to happen, obviously was not correct. It's been a crazy, wild roller coaster ride. I don't think next year is going to be any easier. But we're starting out next year with, I believe, certain sectors in the equity market. Certain sectors are still just in denial, in my opinion. They've been able to ride through 2021 and shrug all this stuff off, all these developing concerns. I'm not sure they're going to make it another year. Again, going back to my first point, these things go on longer than you think they can. But when they do turn, they turn very, very quickly. Remember what I mentioned earlier about the 1905 revolution in Russia, attempted revolution, excuse me, that fails. And it's another 12 years and a world war before there's finally a proper revolution that topples the government. Well, that revolution, of course, was led by Lenin, among others. And he famously said of the revolution is that, history is when decades happen in days. So when things really turn, when things really change, it can happen extremely quickly. And you either have your portfolio constructed in the right way, you've either got the positions on that you want, or you're going to miss it. And I think that's an important consideration going into next year.
Certainly. Is the Lenin line? There are decades where nothing happens, and then there are days when decades happen.
Yeah, something like that. I'm paraphrasing, but yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah. So am I. I'm pretty sure that's not the exact quote, but no, very, very, very relevant to our current situation. I do feel very apprehensive about what we'll see occur next year. But yes, we have reached the end of the show, folks. So thank you all so much for tuning in. We wish you a very Merry Christmas, very happy holiday season, and of course a very happy Hogmanay. This is me in Aberdeen. Hopefully they won't shut all of the pubs down for Hogmanay. If they do, I will be a very, very unhappy bunny. But we'll see. And indeed, in terms of my my long and short for the year, I think this time I'll just say I'm very long eggnog, because I've never had eggnog before, and it really is quite fantastic. I can see why so many people like it. But that is all for this year, folks. We shall be back in January. So if you do have any suggestions of what you would like to see in the shows next year, do just leave them in the comments if you're watching a recording of this, or indeed just leave it in the live chat. For we shall be looking over those and seeing how we can make the show even better in the coming year. But that's all from us for the moment. We wish you a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and we'll see you next year. Have a good one, folks.